Und apropos zusätzliche Bereicherung, ich denke, das ist ein gutes Stichwort, um ins nächste Panel abzugeben und an den Kollegen Ralf Süthoff, du hast gerade schon das so schön angekündigt. Titel nochmal: The Humanitarian Development Nexus When Disaster Struck, Disaster Risk Management and the COVID-19 Response in Lebanon.
بعد حصول انفجار 4 آب قام الصليب الأحمر بتفعيل خطة الانفجار، وعادة الصليب الأحمر هو جاهز لكل أنواع الكوارث اللي عم تصير ومحطط لها خطط احترازية، وبتتفعل الخطة بناء على الحدث الموجود. بعد ماكسيموم نص ساعة لقينا أنه الحجم هو كتير كبير كتير ضخم، فقررنا أنه نفعل خطة الطوارئ اللي بتحاكي سيناريو حرب مثل حرب 2006. بعد هال 24 ساعة اللي قطعوا الصليب الأحمر بيكون بعملية إنقاذ الأرواح، بنروح كمان لحتى نتابع الاستجابة عبر عدة قطاعات موجودة بالصليب الأحمر. ما بننسى هون ننوه بدور وحدة الحد من المخاطر اللي كان من أهم أهدافها العمل مع المجتمعات المحلية. شاركوا المجتمع المحلي بالاستجابة.
الحد من المخاطر نقاط أساسية بتخلي الصليب الأحمر يقدر يستجيب لكل هالمهمات، والمستجيب الأول هو المجتمع المحلي، نحن المستجيب الثاني. التحضير بعد هيوغو كونفنشن وبعد سنداي خلى الصليب الأحمر مع اللوكال اوتوريتيز ومع الحكومة ومع الببليك والبرايفت سيكتورز يتجهزوا تيستجيبوا لهذا الموضوع ويصير في ثقة أكثر بالصليب الأحمر.
من تاريخ شباط 2020 بلشت عنا أزمة الكوفيد 19. الشغل اللي كانت عم تعمله وحدة إدارة مخاطر الكوارث بالصليب الأحمر من ناحية التشبيك مع المجتمعات والسلطات والتقوية تبعهم خلتها تكون محضرة أكثر لتستجيب هي والمجتمع. وأكيد لقينا فرق بين المجتمعات اللي كانت محضرة والمجتمعات اللي هي ما كانت محضرة. ما كان كتير هين بالنسبة لنا التعامل مع انفجار مرفأ بيروت وبنفس الوقت نكون عم ناخد بعين الاعتبار كوفيد 19. كان الهدف الكبير هو واحد بالدرجة الأولى نشيل معالم الانفجار، نشيل الأنقاض، نفتح الطرقات، العالم تقدر تكون عم ترجع للحياة تدريجيا، تقدر الجمعيات تقدر توصل لتأمن الخدمات اللي هي موجودة عنا. بناء عليه كان عنا فريق للصليب الأحمر موجود ببيروت بغرفة عمليات المتقدمة للجيش، عنا فريق موجود بقلب محافظة جبل لبنان لنكون عم نعمل تنظيم وتظافر جهود البلديات والجمعيات المحلية اللي هي كانت بدها تساعد.
دور الصليب الأحمر جدا فعال، ما قصروا بأي مساعدة طلبناها، إن كانت لوجستية أو حتى كانت تقنية أو حتى كانت من النواحي الخدماتية بما خص الأشخاص المنكوبين.
خبرتنا بتقول إنه الصليب الأحمر بيكون جاهز أكثر من غيره. لهالسبب من ثاني يوم الصبح نحن كنا عم ننسق مع الصليب الأحمر شو ممكن نعمل شغل، ومن هون طلعنا بفكرة إنه نعمل غرفة عمليات ضمن نطاق جبل لبنان نكون قادرين نحن نتحرك فيها، ولكن على تماس مع بيروت.
تم إنشاء نقطة متقدمة تم تقديمها من قبل بلدية فرن الشباك بالتنسيق مع محافظ جبل لبنان، وكان فيها عدد كتير كبير من الجمعيات. الصليب الأحمر اللبناني اشتغل على تأمين كل الاحتياجات اللوجستية الأساسية المطلوبة، وكنا عم نشتغل على شيء دائما بنسميه الكومبلمنتري ابروتش، هو تكامل جهود الجميع تنوصل للهدف الأساسي اللي نحن بدنا إياه. كنا أكيد بكل الاستجابة تبعنا عم ناخذ بعين الاعتبار إجراءات الحماية والسلامة للكوفيد 19 من ناحية الإرشادات، من ناحية التعليمات، من ناحية المعلومات، ومن ناحية المعدات.
بدي أقول له للمواطن نحن دايما معك، دايما حدك، بالصيف وبالشتاء، بالليل بالنهار، بالأعياد وبالأحزان وبالأفراح، نحن معك على طول، رح نتساعد سوا، نتحمل بعضنا كلنا سوا، بقدر ما نتعاون ننجح.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody from Berlin. After this little inspiration, I'm more than honored to welcome you to a panel where in the next hour we would like to discuss following a lot of interesting discussion about disaster, risk reduction and other cross-cutting topics before. Now, it's interlinkages and challenges between DRR and humanitarian development nexus, and like to showcase that looking at one country example, Lebanon. My name is Ralf Süthoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, a Berlin-based think tank, and honored to host this, having been based in the region until 2018. Lebanon is still to my heart, and the topic surely extremely relevant one. However, at the same time, most of you will know Lebanon is facing a variety of risks, of crises and disasters, with the last being just the last one in a long history of shocks, of political instability, of economic downfall. At the same time, hazards hit Lebanon in a time in which the country is still hosting the highest per capita number of refugees, with Palestine and Syrian refugees in the country, and is linked into various conflict settings in the region. So this makes, in a way, it's sad, but also a very interesting case to look into the outline topic. These multiple challenges make it obvious that a holistic approach is needed to deal with the country challenges in Lebanon, and that to link it to the humanitarian development nexus as a framework will be a key challenge how to move forward in Lebanon and beyond. However, that's surely easier said than done, so I'm very proud and honored that today other ones need to share the very smart answers. So we have a distinguished panel I'm happy to present. In order of appearance, we welcome Tiana Hickel, from the head of MENA region at the German Red Cross. Good morning, Tiana. We welcome Katie Peters, Senior Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London. Good morning, Katie. And we welcome on the donor side, on the German donor side, Martin Schuldes from the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, where he's the head of division for peace, security, and disaster risk management. Good morning, Martin Schuldes. And we welcome Benjamin Hanna, the deputy head of division of the unit of implementation of humanitarian assistance at the German Federal Foreign Office. Please allow me to start from the practitioner side and asking Tiana in the first place, given your background, you have lived in the region a couple of years, in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine. How would you explain in a bit more detail what does DRR mean in a context like Lebanon? How does the Red Cross work in the country, and what did all this mean, for example, for the latest response? Over to you, Tiana.
Thank you, Ralf. So as you have seen in the movie, and as well how our work is, what is quite important from the beginning to see that for the Lebanese Red Cross, that is one context and with different layers as you outlined, not in terms of hazards, of risks, but as well of vulnerabilities and so on. So it dictates for the Lebanese Red Cross, and it doesn't matter if you ask the SecGen, for example, which risk, which disaster, if it's the blast, if it's COVID or so, that is actually not, well, I wouldn't say important, but that is not in the center. In the center are the people, because that dictates that the people are in the center. So what is LRC is doing and how it's working? In terms of DRR and DRM, and as well linking that with the whole response and seeing that their program and as well their context. So they call it a bit like an onion model. So the onion model means that individual is in the center, the communities, different communities are in the center. They are working with their teams to assessing the vulnerabilities, the capabilities, and as well linking that up with the structures, with the local structures, with the regional structures, with the national structures, and as well on the other side down, from the national down, again, down on the community. So when you see what LRC in their DRR terms, when on the local level, they start with the schools, with neighborhood committees, and really integrating them in their analysis and of their capacities and vulnerabilities. And this is the main objective in the end is you have the resilient person, individual, and as well all the local structures as well prepared. And when the disaster strikes, it doesn't matter if you have COVID or the blast or something. that they are prepared, that they can respond to all different kind of disasters or hazards. So this is the idea, or this multi-hazard approach, what the Lebanese Red Cross is trying or doing to implement that. But what is important to say, because or I said that in the beginning, that is this one context to work in, and they have to deal with that. So yeah, I don't know if
Many thanks. Many thanks for that, Tiana. To put it in a nutshell, would you say a key lesson learned is that pre-analysis of your setting, of the people you deal with, and integration with the people themselves is the key to be prepared, even for a blast like in Beirut, where many people will say, well, how can you prepare for such an explosion?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are working with the Lebanese Red Cross, I don't know, now since 10 years, I think, on the terms of disaster risk reduction and DRM as German Red Cross. And it was obvious that, and we did a lot of mistakes in the beginning or together, and we learned, it was a long learning process, that the only, so the key lessons learned is first, that really you develop or you have a long-term joint vision, or the local partner has a long-term vision, what they want to reach. And it can't be like, okay, you have one little project which is going like 1 year, 2 years, you need a long-term strategy. That is one thing, or long-term vision. The second one is quite important, that you go really from the community up to the national level to make the things sustainable when you work in the disaster risk reduction. That you make, for example, when you access a community and you start analyzing with the community and so on, for example, a school community. So when you fill the fire extinguishers, for example, it's really nice to equip, and you have funny evacuation plans and everything. But when you don't have a long-term and link to the local structures, like, okay, who is refilling the fire extinguish? Who is doing the trainings and doing the long-term and trainings, the evacuation plans, and as well transferring the information and the knowledge as well to, for example, to the broader curricula of the Ministry of Education or so, that there is a clear plan, then it doesn't work. So, or it works, but might be not in a long term and in a sustainable way. Mm-hmm. So that is the second key message. And my third, what I learned, or when I work with the Lebanese Red Cross, what we have seen, they are the experts. They know their context, and they know how to organize and how to approach programmatically, difficult word, programmatically their context and their communities. So, yeah, this I would say would be the three key lessons learned from the class. Yes.
Thank you, and thanks for being so frank. If you compare the lessons learned to mistakes done before, like what are mistakes other organizations, for example, should avoid? What is the lessons learned? What have you done in the beginning and shouldn't be the approach you could recommend
on? Well, for us, it was a bit of a time frame was a problem. Yeah, when we planned or we were working with the Lebanese Red Cross, the time frame we planned too short, actually. That was a mistake, that we only did you did the plan of action, for example.
You're a bit broken at my end now, Tiana. At least I can't hear you anymore. Okay, maybe Tiana will fix her line. Katie, you can still hear me, can you? Perfect. So as you would be the next one, and Tiana has set the stage already. Maybe for now we move on. Katie, the Overseas Development Institute is well positioned to put this into an even broader picture. You've done studies on disaster risk reduction, especially in fragile and conflict settings. You've authored a study on Lebanon. So if you could tell us a bit more about your research on Lebanon and the key findings, what does it mean to do disaster risk reduction in a comprehensive and sustainable way? Over to you.
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, so just for those of you that aren't aware, last year, together with some of my colleagues, Kerry Holloway and Nuha Eltenay, we undertook a case study of DRR in Lebanon. And it was part of a much bigger project funded by the German government on a whole sort of bigger initiative around trying to explore what happens when disasters and conflicts collide. Now, what I think is particularly interesting about Lebanon, certainly in comparison to our other cases, which were Colombia, Afghanistan, and Chad, the case of Lebanon told quite a different story because it challenged many people's perceptions about what a conflict context looked like. So, for example, our research team and certainly myself, I was told repeatedly by people outside of the country that Lebanon was neither a conflict context nor a hazard-prone context. But recent events have unfortunately shown that that's simply not true. And even during the research, in the space of just 1 week, I witnessed a winter storm that forced the evacuation of over 600 Syrian refugees from the camps in Lebanon. We got caught in a landslide blocking a major road connecting Beirut and Tripoli. And we also saw the impact of coastal flooding on informal settlements of some of the country's poorest communities. I think where Lebanon was also interesting was that it challenged many popular approaches to disaster risk reduction. So, for example, a lot of the approaches typically start with the natural hazard. But the Lebanese perceptions of risk, and Tiana certainly emphasized this, they're dominated by other concerns, whether it's sectarian violence, whether it's cross-border conflict. And we found that the general public had little concern, or quite frankly, little interest for example, earthquake or fire risk. Now, rather than being an impediment to disaster risk reduction, we found that the Lebanese Red Cross were able to build on the trust that they had developed with communities, particularly the trust that they had built while trying to work with communities to prevent and prepare for conflict. And they used that as a leverage to then think about other hazards that communities would not typically think about, including, for example, earthquake, flood, and fire risk. The other thing we found in our research was that there was some what we called unusual suspects getting involved in disaster risk reduction. So one agency, for example, who would prefer not to be named, they had a mandate to work very strictly on issues of conflict and armed violence, but they actually were doing flood protection work under a very broad interpretation of their conflict protection mandate. So I say that because I think Lebanon is interesting because it reveals actually what can be achieved when we think more holistically about risk, and also what can be achieved with just a very little support. Investment, for example, by Germany, UNDP and other donors have really transformed the way that a lot of community groups think about risk in Lebanon, and that needs to be built on. What I would say, though, is that there is much that needs to be done still. We've seen successive governments have failed to heed the warnings about the storage of ammonium nitrate that were held at the city's port. And we continually found a complacency about earthquake risk. And there was so many examples of risk accumulating, particularly in urban informal settlements, that were putting conflict displaced populations at risk, whether we're talking about those that moved from Palestine 40 years ago or those that moved from Syria in 2011. And again, we repeatedly found that many of those groups were largely excluded from DRR policies and plans. So there's a lot still to be done.
Many thanks, Katie. Great insights in very concrete terms and lessons learned on how external and internal perceptions can differ and how important it is to identify with the locals or by the locals what the key risks are they see and what the priority is from their end. If you link your research to the issue, if it's so a multi-issue challenge and so many layers come into it, by nature, dealing it with a humanitarian and development angle is needed. What's your lesson learned? How does it play into this long-standing debate about the humanitarian development nexus, and which challenges do you see on that front?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I completely agree with you, Ralph. I think in many respects, the humanitarian and development nexus is quite a well-worn debate. It's certainly been going for over 30 years now. But it has resurged, and I think for a number of reasons. One is that we've seen a lot of new financing initiatives, things like crisis modifiers, anticipatory action, and they've really forced the development and humanitarian practitioners to think more constructively about how we transition into and out of crisis situations. I think one of the other reasons why we've seen a resurgence of this debate is because in protracted crisis contexts, we're seeing humanitarian development and peace agencies all operating simultaneously. And I think there's other reasons. A final one I'll mention is new thematic areas. So for example, all of the debates around climate change and conflict, now they span traditional mandates of both development and humanitarian agencies. So we've seen a resurgence of this debate. I think despite the fact that this has been going on for some years, there's still a number of barriers that we've not got across yet. So for example, practical barriers, things like funding silos, a historical legacy of a bifurcated system. And there's also some principled barriers. For example, different mandates, upholding principles of neutrality. Those things I don't think are going to go away very easily. And it's because of that actually I wonder whether we need to reframe the debate a little bit. Rather than talking about the humanitarian development nexus, it might be more helpful to start thinking about the challenge of dealing with complex risk. And if we do that, actually it leads us to quite different questions. So instead of, for example, thinking about introverted questions around the aid system itself, instead what we think about is risk contexts in which we operate. And it also leads us to think about, for example, what are the risk management systems that are required to address 21st century risks? And what is the place of a humanitarian and development and potentially even peace actors within those systems? So I think it's getting to the same point, which is that we need to think more constructively about how we all work together to deal with the current challenges. But I think it gets us away from some of those old debates that have become a little bit stagnant and where we don't seem to have moved forward. And I think Lebanon is a really good example of this. Lebanon today is contending with the aftermath of the blast, also COVID-19, also Syrian displacement, also exacerbated fragile peace in light of the response to the blast, and also less visible hazards like seismic risk. Now, if we think not necessarily in terms of humanitarian development nexus, but how do we deal with that complex risk scenario, we then start to think about, for example, what types of different risk management systems are required to deal with those risks, and what is the role of humanitarian and development actors in those systems. So let me maybe just close by pointing to a few ways forward. I mean, firstly, I do think we need to be very concerned about the implications of COVID, and particularly the implications it's having on national budgets and overseas development assistance. Because what we have seen repeatedly is that there are many examples where emergency reserves have already been spent on the pandemic, despite the fact that there are upcoming disaster seasons. What we can do, I think, proactively is to get behind the calls for green and more resilient recovery and economic stimulus packages. And if we can do that in a really structured and strategic way, we can start to make the case for the co-benefits of disaster resilience in conflict contexts, even in places where COVID is by far the priority. The second thing I would say is that I think the disaster risk management community is really well placed to be exploring the relationship between different risk governance regimes. So, for example, how we manage natural hazards, how we manage urban flood risk, and how we manage inter-community violence. Each of those things have different systems for managing risk, even when they occur in the same location. And it's a little bit like the point that Tiana was making. We need to think much more seriously about the complexity of risks that are occurring in particular geographies, and then take a serious look at the way that we respond to those, and to try and pull out some of the greater coherences that could be achieved by thinking and acting more together. And then the final thing I would just say is that I think we need to be thinking much more creatively around risk financing. Whether, for example, that's scaling up anticipatory action, which Germany has been doing for a while now, or it's other initiatives like investing in crisis modifiers. We really need to be thinking, acting, and financing in ways that really work for the complexity of the 21st century risk landscape. And that's something that we just don't do at the moment.
Many thanks, Katie. Tiana, as you are back online, I see and hope that it's stable for now. Maybe quickly back to you before we move on to the other colleagues, if that's fine. Talking about the humanitarian development nexus implications. On the one hand, I'm sure you have practical experience how this plays out, for example, in the Lebanon response or in the Middle East, where you have been based. But let me maybe also add, because we like to address this question often only to donors, and of course we will discuss it with the donor colleagues, but isn't this also an organizational, an agency issue? Do we need a change of cultures, of perceptions on the way we manage risks in aid organizations, for example? If you have any feedback on that one as well, that would be most welcome. And maybe we give you another 2 minutes to comment on that before we move on.
Yes, thank you. As Katie mentioned already, the importance is the local perspective, because the complex situation, when you see that in Lebanon, it's important to have this view and the perspectives from the local actors, from the local authorities, how you can address the challenges and the different risks.
Okay, and maybe move on.
And as an organization, we have to learn it as well, as a German Red Cross, as different international organizations, to learn that this is the important, the important perspective.
Many thanks for that. I mean, many colleagues, practitioners are pretty frank, for example, about internal challenges. And so far, our research work, for example, confirmed that, even if you look at organizations who have a long-standing dual mandate. Martin Schultes, many thanks for joining us. We are happy that we can discuss with somebody who has such great experience in conflict settings like Afghanistan, where you have been based even twice. And today you deal at the development ministry at a very cross-cutting, in a very cross-cutting position with peace issues, disaster risk management, etc. So maybe to learn in the first place how DRR and everything related is done by the ministries today, and why you put such a focus on it. How does the work is coordinated from your side with colleagues, counterparts in Lebanon, with the colleagues from the foreign ministry? What's the difference to the work, how it's been done years before without this focus, before an emergency in it and right after? And maybe if you are happy to elaborate a bit on that one. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Ralph. Thank you, colleagues, for having me, and also for already providing a lot of input that's also relevant for our work and for the not only for the perception, as we from the ministry, from the headquarter level, see DRR or DRM, but also for the practical work on the ground. Let me first refer to a number of topics or issues that have already been mentioned. For our work and for our perception on disaster risk reduction, it's really important to underline that the context that we are working in and the topic that we are dealing with has become much more difficult and much more complex. If you see at the number of countries that are facing fragility, it has risen. But not only the number has risen, but also the complexity of the conflicts and the duration of these conflicts is much longer and more protracted. And this this needs to have an implication and some kind of repercussion on our work. So what is really important is to follow that kind of, as you have already mentioned, a kind of a holistic, a multi-hazard approach, and to really perceive disaster risk reduction as a cross-cutting issue. It's not limited to one sector, that we have a conflict or a DRR topic or issue in environment or in the water sector or in the area of good governance. It's everywhere in a way. And if we really want to make also policy-wise make a difference in terms of more effective disaster risk reduction, what is really needed is to incorporate it to the best of our abilities. And that's the mandate of my division also in the ministry, to really try to raise topics of disaster risk reduction in all country portfolios, and to try to make it a topic and an issue in all sectors, because it's not only a sector topic, it's a cross-cutting issue. I think this is one of the core central perceptions and also guiding principles for our work. Maybe that's a first
right.
Thought.
Many thanks, Martin. Very interesting. As a follow-up question, maybe the challenge with cross-cutting issues like DRR, like resilience, like gender, is always to cut it really in and to get it really across, especially in institutions and complex institutional settings. So if you could compare the situation now, so you are new in the position, so I'm not sure if that's a fair question. If you compare the situation now to like 10 years ago, how is the development ministry working in different ways to ensure risk management is done in a far-sighted way? It is incorporated in your responses. Is there anything in concrete terms to share already, or is this an approach which needs time and is still in the implementing phase?
Well, it's not an unfair question, certainly not. I mean, we are living in a very complex world, and I would never assume that I have the perfect answer. It's just a thought and a contribution. I mean, maybe let me start by saying what is the same compared to 10 years back. The same is that we don't have enough time to think strategically, because the day-to-day emergency business is so encompassing and time-consuming. But that would be really needed. And one important dimension of taking time and to think more about what you're doing is to better understand the context that you're working in. I mean, Katie, you have underlined that Lebanon was different from expectations, but that is also true for contexts like the Sahel or Afghanistan, where I have been working. So one recommendation and one necessity for our work is to invest more time and more funding also to better understand the context that we are working in. So spending more money for analysis, which is a precondition for evidence-based decision-making. So that's one difference from 10 years back, but also one recommendation for our work. Mm-hmm. Over to you, Ron.
Many thanks, very interesting. Maybe we move on now to Benjamin Hanna, so we can focus a bit on these one or two topics before we move on. Benjamin Hanna, how would you describe what has changed? Germany is a key player in the area of disaster risk reduction, a very generous funder of the efforts. But what has actually changed, like if you compare it to 5-10 years ago, or how would you frame the response, for example, in Lebanon is different to what has been the practice a while ago? Over to you.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor to be on this panel with you. Well, what has changed? I believe different things have changed and also had to change. Number one is that a lot of analytical work has been done in the last years. So looking at the nexus after the World Humanitarian Summit, really a lot has been done on the strategic level, on the global level. But I think also regarding the operationalization of the nexus, we have really made headway. And two examples are, First would be the structures within our system in Germany. So for example, a few years ago, we came up with us, the Foreign Office, and our colleagues from the BMZ with the Chapeau concept paper, which invites organizations that are active both on humanitarian affairs and on the development side in a country to develop projects that both tackle the short-term and immediate needs and the long-term perspective. And this also has an effect on the operational side. For example, in Lebanon, indeed, there is one project which we have piloted, which is just a small project, but still, I think, very interesting to look at. It's a project where we support an NGO called Medico International, and they are doing a health project which on the one hand looks at first healthcare and also on secondary healthcare, and implements it for the local citizens, but at the same time does capacity building for the Lebanese health system, and hence also invests into the long-term future of the sector. And I believe that as a government, as policymakers, we have to, on the one hand, look at what Tiana said, that really take the human being into the focus and involve local communities, but also adapt our structures in order to give the room for our partners to make integrated projects that both respect the mandates of the two sides, which I think do have their relevance and still have to be preserved because they have distinct advantages, but still we should take the benefits from both sides and then allow our partners and give the necessary space to do meaningful projects on the ground.
Many thanks for that, Benjamin. Maybe to follow up on where do we stand on the Nexus side, and are we ready, if we look at the humanitarian development Nexus, to integrate DRR in a comprehensive way and to build a really working setup? Some critics would say, well, on the Nexus side, there has been progress and there are interesting pilots and the Chapeau approach, etc. And then comes a but, like the Chapeau approach is only focusing on transitional assistance and humanitarian aid and not really integrated into long-term efforts. Funding isn't flexible enough. The institutional setup is still complicated, and we can talk about formalities, budget lines, etc. Maybe later if Tanya or Katie want to share some details. How would you comment on that? Where do we stand? Is there has been progress, but it's still very limited, or is that an unfair comment from the practitioners?
No, I think this is a fair point that we are not there yet. At the end of the day, 4 years ago, we really started to have a totally new approach and really formalize it on the international level. And it takes time until it has trickled down into the operational side and also has become mainstream. And I believe that yes, we are still working on it to make it better. And I believe that this is a task not only for the ministries, but also for the NGOs and for the local partners to realize that. And I can say that from a ministry's point of view, we have increased our cooperation and our coordination efforts with our colleagues from BMZ. We now have a organized and structured approach where we share project proposals on a structured way that we receive from our partners, that our colleagues at the BMZ receive. We talk together with our NGO partners in order to discuss the actual situation on the ground, rather than having silos that our partners talk differently with us and then later with the BMZ partners on the same context, but that we do this together and that we look which tools are most apt for a certain situation and how can we approach this together. But I believe really this is nothing trivial. This takes time, and we have made progress, but we are far from being done with that.
Many thanks. Maybe Martin, coming back to you on the bit overarching question on the challenges For one, of course, these things need time, but is it also a structural, a systematic challenge for everybody in this area? Do we need to combine very different cultures of work, long-term approaches, long-term timelines of budgets? The German government has these government negotiations with bilateral counterparts in other settings, which set the frame for years. And it's often difficult to change this and to integrate flexible approaches, new approaches. But on the other hand, you have the humanitarians who are on the spot, who are used to work really fast, to fix things, while not necessarily always coming with a long-term perspective. Do you see here challenges for the sector and on the donor side as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, Ralph, thanks for this interesting question. Maybe you allow me to make a little reference to my previous work in Afghanistan. If I remember the time when I first went to Afghanistan, that was in 2009, and I look at the way of cooperation and the way of dialogue between the ministry, like colleagues from Foreign Office, but also from a Ministry of Defense. There was a different time. At that time, there was a lot of, what are we doing here? Can we really work together? A lot of hesitance, a lot of, I wouldn't say mistrust, but a lack of experience in that kind of cooperation. But if you look at how the situation is today, it really has changed. This is nothing because this is a live performance here. We don't want to paint a rosy picture, certainly not. We still have some barriers to overcome, but really, if you look at the way of cooperation and also the structures that have been established, like the guidelines of the federal government adopted in 2017 for crisis prevention and building peace, that is the strategic framework for the entire federal government for our engagement in fragile context. So this is really kind of a milestone. Of course, it requires perseverance and a constant dialogue. And in some cases, we are not as fast as we should be, and as the civil society organization want us to be, but I really do see progress. Maybe a final point, you said, well, there seems to be a lag between these high-speed things coming from the civil society organizations or from humanitarian aid and the long-term thinking in decade development cooperation. Here, I would like to inform you that from the BMZ side, we crafted a new instrument, which we call, and we talked about this yesterday, the Transitional Development Assistance, which is supposed to build bridges in two ways with regard to humanitarian aid, but also with regard to long-term development cooperation. How do we do this? Because the TDA can be established very quick and flexible, but it can also be established in a 5-year time horizon. So it's both. It's short-term oriented towards humanitarian aid, but it's also long-term oriented as something in between, something that was missing in the past, deliberate instrument in the process in between.
Thank you. Maybe a final question for Benjamin before we ask Gati and Tiana how they view these developments. Benjamin, in very concrete terms, for example, one indicator often highlighted is the flexible funding, and critics say, well, Germany is performing very well in terms of quantity of funding, while, for example, its flexibility is fairly low also by international standards. And if I'm not misled, it has rather decreased from like 14-15% to single-digit numbers lately. Could this be an issue if you look at an area like disaster risk reduction, comprehensive responses, being agile and allowing agencies to invest where it's needed for such an approach?
Well, yes, of course, for us, the target is to have as flexible funding as possible. And we have indeed now, talking of the COVID crisis, we have given a large amount of our funding, which we received from the federal parliament as an extra to tackle the humanitarian effects of COVID, almost unearmarked. It was only earmarked on the GHRP, and our partner organizations, particularly the international organizations, were given funds to be used wherever it is needed in order to tackle the day-to-day needs of COVID-19. At the same time, we also introduced more flexible projects with our NGOs. We introduced global projects where we allocated, where we gave funding to our NGO partners for a certain set of countries, and the funds can be transferred from one country to the other without further permission from our side, but only on the basis of that we are being informed. And this is for sure something that we will be looking at in the future too. At the same time, of course, this comes with a higher interest both by our donor, the parliament, to know where the funds are being used, and also to make sure that compliance issues are being followed. So more flexibility on the one side probably also requires a bit more reporting than on the other side. But what I also wanted to say, just to, before I conclude, is regarding the idea again of making the Nexus more active and more realizing it better. We still must not forget that there are good reasons for having different mandates for the humanitarian side and the developed side. And sometimes it sounds as if this was only a weakness and impediment to be more practical. But we as the humanitarians, we depend on the humanitarian principles to have unhindered access everywhere, no matter how the political relations are with the government, no matter who is in charge. At the same time, our partners from the development side do benefit from having long-term and grown relationships with the governments. And I think we should really reap the fruits of both mandates and not try in the discussion to somehow merge them, because I believe that the status quo after would not be better than now.
Many thanks. Very interesting point, how to deal with the different mandates which have their good reasons while can become a practical obstacle. That's surely one of the key challenges for all actors in the field, and surely a valid point. Plus the political dilemma. I mean, we might have a conflict of interest that on the one hand, in the political arena, if you want to raise funds, it's very hard to do that in an unearmarked way. As I can also share from my Syria crisis experience, where of course the Germans have stepped up, but in an earmarked way because the parliament wanted to know where to spend the funds. So we have these named a couple of dilemmas. Maybe moving it back to a very practical level, Tiana, to start with you. You have been in the region, you have dealt with all this funding lines, and you know the colleagues on the ground. How does that play out? I mean, how do you deal with this donor landscape, which is not a specific German issue? If you look at the European Commission, it can be challenging, and you have various kinds of reportings, regulations, and more or less inflexible budget regulations. Is that a real issue, or is it only a theoretical debate?
Thank you, Ralph, for the question. I would like to mention I totally agree with the two, with Mr. Hanna and Mr. Schuldes, that a lot of progress was made in terms of the thinking of the Nexus and the two ministries. But for me, still, when we as the German Red Cross, or we start working in a context, then we automatically accept the reality, or the reality is that we put the local people in the center. So that is one thing. When it comes to the Nexus now, the challenges or what we have, the work, what our partners do or we do together with our partners, it's not too complicated in a complicated context like Lebanon, for example. To do resilience work on the community level what they do. I mean, they know what they have to do, and it's not, in programmatic wise, it's not so difficult. What is more difficult actually to bring this practical work, and the nexus is really practical and human on the local level. It's more difficult to break it down, this work, into projects, for example. There's a lot of fear, and that what is, for example, we are facing. I mean, there's a lot of fear of duplication, for example, of duplication of different funding streams, of different, or if it's or instruments. So and of course, then you have to see, when you watch the video, for example, you see the DRR teams who are preparing since a long time, engaging in the communities, linking with the communities, with the local, the national, regional structures on the one side. But when the disaster strikes, as the blast, as you can see, where they act and they are coordinating, for example, all the neighborhood committees, where you have seen in the video, where they were equipped, where they're organized, where they're on the spot when the disaster is there. So, for example, if you take then the salary of the DM director, who is there, the DRR director, who is organizing, who is doing long-term work with their teams, with the communities, the liaison with all the different, with the different stakeholders. And at the same time, when there is the blast, we're sitting in the operational room and doing and organizing the immediate response for whatever cash-based distributions, or as well to cleaning the streets and so on, the whole coordination. So there you see, there's in the middle of the nexus. So what does it mean in the end? Where you put the salary of this DM director? Or, I mean, this is a little example, but this is exactly where the people living in the reality of the nexus, where they approach, or they have to deal with the different risk and the consequences of the disaster.
Many thanks, Tiana. Just quickly reminding the audience to use the chat function and the face-to-face button you can comment on, because in a few minutes we give to the floor. But Katie, as you share with us a very international perspective on this a bit Germany-focused debate today, if you put what we talked about, the donor landscape, humanitarian development nexus, into a broader perspective, DFID, for example, has often been praised to have moved in a more flexible direction. At the same time, it has moved very far lately into being integrated in the foreign ministry. But would you have any views if you listen to the debate about the German setup and the progress made and limitations? How does this play out if you put it into a broader international context? Any views from your side?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think across the board, many donors have got little pockets of real innovation and inspiration. I think in the financing sector, for example, USAID and DFID have both, or FCDO, as we now have to call it, have both experimented with crisis modifiers. We've seen a lot of governments, including Germany, supporting things like anticipatory action. Also adaptive social protection has its place. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from. I think one of the big challenges, though, is just thinking systematically about what is it we're trying to achieve. You know, the humanitarian and development sector are not homogenous entities in themselves. So when, for example, we're talking about bringing together, we really have to ask, well, for what purpose? And for me, that's where sort of using a context like disaster risk reduction in Lebanon or in other crisis contexts is useful, because then we can start to think about what are the realities on the ground. So where you do have natural hazard related disasters in conflicts of context, then to me, it makes sense that we need to start thinking about this nexus in the context of bringing together disaster risk management agencies together with conflict and peace specialists. So that's, I think, how I quite like to look at it. And I did actually just want to pick up on something that Martin said, where we need more money for analysis. I mean, I would certainly agree with that. Part of the work that we did last year, funded by the German government, was actually to try and look more critically at the kinds of tools and approaches that are being used to understand contexts by disaster risk managers. And one of the things that we found, despite looking at over 50 vulnerability and capacity assessments, disaster recovery frameworks, all of those different tools and methods would often in some way refer to the context being one that has issues of violence or fragility or conflict. But we found very limited evidence that that understanding of conflict actually influenced the design and delivery of DRR interventions. Now, what we don't know is whether those interventions, therefore, and it's not just within Lebanon, but worldwide, whether those interventions are conflict blind, or whether people just aren't documenting the changes to the design and delivery of those DRR interventions when they're working in very high risk places. So I would probably add to Martin's call for more money for analysis, actually for more money to actually start to learn from those experiences where people are really actively bringing together conflict and peace specialists together with disaster risk management actors. Because I think from the very small examples we have, and I would stress these are very small, where we do have evidence where that's happened, actually there's been some really interesting and really novel collaborations across the humanitarian development nexus. So, for example, in Haiti, there are examples of peace and reconciliation specialists working with people that are focused on flood risk reduction measures to achieve combined outcomes. And it was the same in Afghanistan. We found some really good examples of local level conflict analysis tools being integrated into DRR projects. But the documentation of those really good examples are very few and far between. So that's really where I think we need to be moving towards.
Very interesting, many things. If nobody disagrees, I sense there's a consensus that we might need to move, for example, funds and resources from if we can't expand them, which would be the case in an ideal world, maybe to change the share of funds we invest in our own capacities and the government capacities and aid agencies capacities and in local capacities versus on the program side. So we better know why we do things compared to expanding all kinds of programs and initiatives. But maybe that's putting it in a very small nutshell. Stefan, is there anything right now you would like to share from the chat? So just to make sure we don't run out of time to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ralph. We have one question from another Martin, actually, concerning estimating and evaluating risks at local level. Martin Schuldes mentioned the aspect of variabilities of risks depending on the context. Eventually, we need to include estimating and managing multiple risks. How can we correctly estimate and finally manage the many different risks, avoiding or overcoming local tendencies, such as, for example, the complacency that the blast in Beirut clearly demonstrated?
Many thanks for that, Stefan. Maybe if I'm allowed to add one point to that one linked. Our colleagues from French think tank URD have done a real-time evaluation of the Lebanon response. And that's interesting. It came out already. And I'm just mentioning it because they shared another point linked to this interesting question from the audience. For them, it was very important to make sure everybody is aware in such emergency settings. We always talk about calibrating needs, about only estimates, and about a tendency to exaggerate needs and what is needed on the ground. So we need to be aware that we have a very difficult playing field. And I think that links an aspect to what has been raised from the audience. Martin, would you be happy to address this question?
Well, the starting point for me would be also speaking from a ministerial level. What can we do in order to support our partner countries, also with a focus on the target groups, to make sure that people are doing better in a crisis or conflict context now, but also in a long-term perspective. You know, we from BMZ, we are the ministry for the decades in a way. So we always think on a long-term, in long-term perspective, and therefore the starting point is what can we do in order to promote the betterment of these long-term decisions. And at the heart of that is to help or support governments in taking risk-informed decisions. So what does it take to take these risk-informed decisions is to create better data, see what is the context like, what kind of problems do we face, what are the key actors, so what is the essence of a conflict or this problem. That's why we need more data, we need better data, maybe more effort or funding for these analyses, but also support the capacities of governments to use that kind of information, data evaluation, evidence-based material for decision making and for incorporating that kind of information into DRR national strategies. So that would be my reply to that question.
Right. Maybe as a follow-up question, do you think more partnerships and more cooperation could also help on this front? If we look at an evaluation we did on the triple nexus, actually, for example, on the conflict side, we perceived a substantial lack of agencies to understand conflicts, to analyze conflict sensitivity approaches, and to lack resources, of course, to do it all by themselves, while there's a surprising lack of partnerships going on such a cross-cutting issue. Could that help to have better coordination between agencies, but maybe also between donors?
Sure. I mean, we also feel that there's some kind of a deficiency, that we do not have enough information or data. I wouldn't never say that we from the German side live in a perfect world here, regardless of the wonderful cooperation, Katie, we had with you from ODI just recently. But there's a lot of information gathering has already been done, is underway, but there's a huge demand, given the fact, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the barometer of fragility is unfortunately rising or increasing over the next year. So the need for that kind of professional information is increasing. And it would be a kind of a wise decision to establish instruments and mechanisms of information sharing, so that all parties that would require these pieces of information for their own risk-informed decision-making, that they can tap these resources. So maybe that's a new front of cooperation to really try to establish better channels or a wider spectrum of information and cooperation in that area.
Right. Benjamin, Hannah, I'm not sure if you're keen to comment on these topics. If so, raise your hand. You will have the chance to have a final word, or Katie and Tiana, same. Stefan, we are running out of time. Is there any pressing issue you would like to share from the floor?
We have actually one more question that we could raise here. In which way is the topic of social protection or linking cash and voucher assistance with social protection on the agenda? Is it a way to help strengthen the humanitarian development nexus by addressing the underlying poverty and vulnerabilities?
Benjamin, cash is a nice question for the Foreign Office, I would say, and not a mean one. So maybe you want to take that over, and I don't know if Tiana or Katie want to comment on cash as well.
Yes, indeed. Of course, I never expected any mean question here. No, definitely. Yeah. I mean, innovative financing, although cash is not innovative anymore, the purists would say, but this is something very important for us. We have been very active on the international, in the UN system in promoting the cash and voucher system. And we believe that this is really a very important means in order to strengthen the responsibility and the dignity of the people in need. So yes, definitely, I can only agree that we should and we are looking into ways to expand this. And we are in dialogue with our partners, especially from the international organizations like UNHCR, WFP, in order to really apply these means in the best possible way in order to help the people in the best possible way. Because this also relates to the whole debate that we should also get away from looking at the recipients of our assistance as victims, but really looking at them as subjects that have to take their things into their own hands, and that we want to bring back into a decent, normal life again. And these tools are a very important means to do that.
From my own experience, I can share that indeed cash assistance has been an interesting debate, both in integrating humanitarian development efforts, but also a challenging one, if we talk about the mandates and then whose role of responsibilities. But surely on the social protection side, a really, really interesting debate. As we are running out of time, to give you all the chance to have a final comment, if you look at the past 60 minutes, what would be the one takeaway you want to make sure the audience really will remember? What is the one takeaway on this topic of disaster risk reduction in the context of humanitarian development nexus? Anything coming to your mind you really would like to stress once again to make sure we keep working and thinking about it on that one? Tiana, you started, so you have to start now again. Sorry for that.
Okay, one last sentence I would take out is that it's important that all partners, all stakeholders as well here and in the field do have the same look and a joint planning and analyzing and looking to one context. I think this is important. And there I think we can, getting more stronger to address.
Thank you. Katie, would you like to follow?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's hard to pick out one, but I think I would probably say that at the moment, I really do feel like the risk management systems we have in place at the moment are not fit for purpose, because the reality is on the ground, people are already struggling with compound and complex risks. And yet the risk governance systems we have aren't responding to those at the level of complexity that's needed. So for me, I think we really need to get serious and think about better partnerships, about more innovative partnerships and innovative financing mechanisms to really respond to 21st century risks that are already upon us.
Thank you, Katie. Martin, any final point you would like to highlight again?
Well, I think my takeaway would be there's a lot of common understanding of the huge challenge in front of us, but also a lot of joint effort and willingness. You know, we always talk about you can have a brilliant idea, but if there's no willingness, no political willingness, nothing would change. So that I would consider as a good prospect for doing better in a very complicated and challenging topic and environment. And thank you for having me, by the way.
Thank you. It's been our honor. Benjamin.
Yeah, my takeaway would be that early action is not only a nice to have, but given the growing humanitarian needs, giving also the looming economic crisis because of COVID-19 and the challenges to raise enough humanitarian funding, acting early and preventing crisis is really a necessity for us today. It reduces costs, and it also is the most effective and most dignified way to help the people in need. So I think really this should not only be a niche topic, but really the central topic of our work together. And I also second Martin that a lot has been done and that we are moving into the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for joining this and making the time. For me, it was really interesting as well. One of my key takeaways have been very good examples about what a difference it makes to switch from an external to an internal look and really to listen to the people and which risks and priorities they see, which might be very different to the ones we sometimes have on mind. We will discuss exactly such issues, indeed, as Stefan already kindly mentioned in our CHAR annual conference next week on the triple nexus, adding even another layer with a peace leg to it and other contexts like Mali, South Sudan, etc. So please feel welcome, everybody in the audience, to join us there. It was me an honor to have you and to host this, and many thanks to the German Red Cross for hosting this whole conference. And with this, back to you, colleagues.
Ja, vielen Dank an das Panel, vielen Dank Ralf und vielen Dank natürlich auch an Stefan. Wir verabschieden uns jetzt hier in die Pause. Im Hauptstream wird es 3 Videos für euch zum Anschauen geben, unter anderem das Interview mit Frank Jörres zum Labor 5000. Und jetzt ist auch der Zeitpunkt gekommen für unsere Meet and Eats. Nochmal, unter dem Chat findet ihr den Button, um euch da jetzt in den Zoom-Raum einzuwählen. Julia wird euch empfangen und platzieren, entweder spontan oder, wenn ihr euch angemeldet habt, dann mit den Teilnehmern, mit denen ihr euch vorher verabredet habt. Ich hoffe, ihr habt eine schöne Pause, guten Appetit, gute Unterhaltung und wir sehen uns hier wieder in einer Stunde.